The Hippie Trail, also known as the Overland Trail, was an overland journey experienced often by members of the counterculture community, or hippies. What began in the 50s extended through the 70s, with the trips originating in London or Amsterdam and the final destinations ranging from Goa to Kathmandu and Bangkok. In many of the stops, travelers found cafes, accommodations, and cannabis. My wife and I recently moved to Evergreen, Colorado, where we met my neighbor Seth, who told me about his time on the Hippie Trail. He joined me on a beautiful summer day at my home in the mountains and shared his story.
My name is Seth Brown. I did the Hippie Trail back in 1974 through 76. All that time was not spent on the Hippie Trail, but just a general outline of who I am. I'm 70 years old. I was born June 14th, 1954 in Houston, Texas, to a Canadian father and an American mother. So I'm an American Canadian, basically. I have a Canadian citizenship. What got me the traveling bug was in high school between 9th and 10th, and 10th and 11th, and 11th and 12th. My parents were very liberal, and I had a work ethic, and I always worked, and I had money. And for the summers between those grades, my parents would let me take off with a friend. And one year we went up the West Coast, up through Arizona, New Mexico, into California. And one year I went with my brother. We went up and lived on some hippie communes up in Colorado and New Mexico for about 5 weeks. And then my last trip between 11th and 12th, I went up the East Coast with another friend all the way up to Toronto, Canada, where my dad was born, to get a feeling of what his life was like. When I graduated high school, I knew right away that college was not my forte, and my parents knew that. And for my graduation, they bought me a Euro pass for Western Europe. We have to remember back in those days, 1974, there was Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So there were countries that I could not go to because of Eastern Europe. But the Euro pass was good in 11 countries in Western Europe, and it started the first day I used it. So I spent 2 months, it was a 2-month Euro pass for $187. And I went through all the normal Western European countries of Spain, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Sweden. After 2 months, I bought a car with another friend who flew over to meet me, and we took it over on the hovercraft from Calais to Dover. And I spent a couple of months, because the Europass wasn't good over in Great Britain. We drove around England, Scotland, and Wales for about 8 weeks. And then we came back to Amsterdam the same way we got there. We came through Dover, Calais, and we drove it back to Amsterdam. And he went home. I sold the car. And this is kind of where the Hippie Trail starts. I drove the car I sold to it was a Kiwi known as a New Zealand guy, and an Aussie's an Australian. He bought the car from basically what I paid for it, and I rode down to Brindisi, Italy with him, and I caught a boat out of Brindisi to Corfu, and I hung out in Corfu for a week or so, and then I call them boats. You caught these little ships that would, sometimes they carried cars, sometimes they carried people. And I did the Greek islands for about 2.5, 3 months. I went to Crete, Rhodes, Mykonos, Syros. I really dug Mykonos. Greece was really inexpensive in those days. And you have to remember that there's really no travel books back in 74, 75. You pretty much had maps, and you didn't have credit cards or money. You used American Express traveler's checks.
How do you find out about the stops and the places you're going? Is it just through talking to other people who've traveled and have done this?
Yes,
backpackers.
Okay. Yes. You learn places to stay, trains to take, buses not to take through other backpackers. Again, I bring this up. Remember, this is 1974, 75, 76, and a bit of 77. And in those days, we didn't have cell phones. We used maps, and our means of financials was American Express traveler's checks. And you could use American Express offices around the world as a post office. So you could write home and say, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm going to be in Kabul, Afghanistan, probably within 3 weeks. And they can write a letter to the American Express office in Kabul, Afghanistan. And when I come into Kabul, I can go to the American Express office, and lo and behold, I have some letters from one of my brothers or my mom and dad, which is pretty cool.
That's really cool. I didn't know that was even a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, they were post offices for people that used American Express traveler's checks.
Amazing.
So after Greece, I was supposed to come home, believe it or not, after my Europass was up. But obviously that did not happen, and my parents wired me the rest of my money into the American Express office in Amsterdam, where I picked it up, and I had traveler's checks. And I had money because I had a work ethic. My mom and dad gave me a work ethic all through high school. I worked. And this whole trip, 32 months, cost about $5,000. From Greece, I wasn't going to go home because I still had $3,000, $3,500 on me. After doing the islands, I went back to Patras, which is the port of Greece, or the port of Athens. And I flew from Athens to Tel Aviv in 1970, into 74, 75. I wanted to work on a kibbutz. I had been traveling now for maybe 8 months, and I wanted to kind of kick back. And I had heard about these kibbutzim. They were communal farms in Israel, where when the Jews returned to Israel back in the 1940s, they didn't feel real safe living in the cities. It was obviously Arab Israelis there, and they were outnumbered. So they tended to live out in the countryside, and they cleared the countryside, and they started these, what we would call communal farms. It's kind of like a Marxism, socialism. Everything goes into the pot. And if you want to have a car to drive your wife and go to the movies that night, you would go to the kibbutznik, as they were called, members of the kibbutz, and you would line up a car. I lived there 9 months. And I was a volunteer. They needed volunteers because of the 73 war. I was there at the end of 74, and a lot of the men were in the armed forces protecting Israel.
Are you of Jewish heritage?
I am. I was born Jewish. I had a bar mitzvah. I raised my kids Jewish. But in the last 30 years or so, I've become more spiritual. It kind of rubbed me wrong with just the financials that ran all the religions, you know. It bothered me what a rabbi made or what a preacher made and your dues.
So, big business.
It's a big business. And
all of them.
All of them are very big businesses. And I just became, as I got older, I became more spiritual. There is a connection when I meet somebody else who, as we call, is an MOT. There is a connection there, there's no doubt. And I had a connection when I was in Israel. Obviously, I was like 21, 22, so I hadn't gone totally spiritual, but I was definitely leaning that way, even being in Israel. The kibbutz was an incredible experience. Volunteers were from all over the world. There were volunteers from America, Canada, Russia, any parts of Western Europe. They really didn't care to have any volunteers from Germany who were not Jewish, but you didn't have to be Jewish to be a volunteer. And you learned a lot. I worked with milking cows, with chickens. I've worked in the cotton fields.
What do you get in exchange for volunteering?
That's a great, incredible question. There were about 25 or 30 of us. It was co-ed. We were probably on a middle-class kibbutz. It was halfway between, when I say middle class, I mean financially. We were located down south, halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And I took many trips at this point in history in 1975. Israel controlled the Sinai Desert. And I took trips down to a little town called Nuweiba and down to Dahab. And that was the first time I ever saw coral reefs in the Red Sea. From that point in the Sinai, you could see Saudi Arabia, you could see Egypt. It was really impressive, and it was a long drive down there. But what they gave the volunteers is 3 good meals a day, a place to lay your head. They were very interesting people, the kibbutzniks. Every 6 weeks, they would load up like a yellow school bus and take all the volunteers on a week-long trip to maybe northern Israel. I went to this place called the Hexagon Pools that were mind-blowing. They called them the Hexagon Pools because all the rocks were hexagon-shaped. I went into Gaza and had dinner twice there. We drove all the way to the tip of Gaza. Gaza's not a very big place, 25 miles by 3 or 4 miles wide. I had the opportunity to go to a Bedouin wedding. I worked with a Bedouin out in the cotton fields, and he invited me to come to his daughter's wedding, which was an honor. That's a whole nother podcast. Being a volunteer on the kibbutz didn't cost me any money, so I was able to save. And you meet people from all over backpacking like me. And the Hippie Trail came up, and you would meet people coming the opposite way. I would meet an Aussie or a Kiwi who was coming from Australia or New Zealand, and so they're coming through Vietnam, Cambodia, into India or Nepal, and they worked their way into the Middle East, and that's where I learned about the Hippie Trail. After about 9 or 10 months, it was time to pack my bags, and there was 2 gentlemen that I had lived with on the kibbutz for 7 or 8 months, and there was 1 female, and they all wanted to hit the Hippie Trail. So what we did is we flew from Tel Aviv to Istanbul, Turkey, which is the beginning of the Hippie Trail, even though you can catch psychedelic buses back in those days. In London, or there were lots of them in Amsterdam, they were everywhere.
So you flew into Istanbul then?
I flew into Istanbul from Tel Aviv, and you didn't need a visa to go to Turkey if you were an American at that time. So we flew into Istanbul, and in Istanbul we spent about a week.
There's so much history in Istanbul, formerly Constantinople.
Yeah. Istanbul was the place where on the Hippie Trail, if you were to Google the Hippie Trail, it starts you in Istanbul. And that's where you got visas. That's where you started getting some of your shots, because you had to have shots to go into where I was going. And I'm going to go through actually my route, because there was a southern route and a northern route. And I took the northern route. In Istanbul, we got visas and shots. We had to get typhoid shot, yellow fever shot, and the American Embassy gave us water purification pills because my final destination was Mount Everest. I wanted to see Mount Everest.
Before we move on here, the northern route includes Tehran, Herat, Kandahar, Kabul, Peshawar, and Lahore. So the route you didn't take then is let's see, what's on the southern route?
You go through Beirut.
Okay, yeah, and then back up to Tehran.
Okay,
got it.
And the reason why Israel's not on the Hippie Trail is because obviously the Jews and Muslims don't get along, and a lot of these countries are Muslim-oriented. And it's really unusual because people think of Shiite or Sunni or Islam. Some of these countries are a lot more tribal than you would think of a Shiite or Sunni. And just as an example, like Afghanistan, they're Shiites and Sunnis, but they're very tribal. And you can have a Shiite village next to another Shiite village, and it's like the Hatfields and McCoys. They just don't get along for one reason or another. One thing I didn't want to do was take one of those hippie buses out of Amsterdam.
I was going to ask, a lot of people leave out of either London or Amsterdam to start the Hippie Trail. And there were guided tours, from what I've been reading, and it could be anywhere from like $30 to $80. And then a reduced rate on the return.
Oh, it's very cheap. It was very cheap.
Very cheap.
Yeah, you're actually. I have a figure I was going to tell you that from Amsterdam to New Delhi, you could pay like $50.
There we are, right in the middle.
And we're talking. This is like 5,000 miles. I think it's 6,000 miles from London to Delhi. I made some notes on how far apart some of these cities that I traveled through were. This is a long trek.
It's interesting that you flew into Istanbul to start, as opposed to taking one of those buses. Did you ever get on one of those buses, or was it all a solo trek?
No, well, I got on one of the buses to see what they looked like, and I talked to people who rode on them. But at that point of my travels, the Hippie Trail wasn't on my list to do. My list to do was to use my Euro pass and do Western Europe. And as I got into Western Europe, I realized that I'm not ready to go back to the States because college was not my forte, even though I had a student ID. That's another story, but I did have a student ID. So when I left Israel and flew to Istanbul. I'll give you a route that I took from Istanbul, and this is over a 4-month period, a 5-month period. And I took the northern route. So I flew from Tel Aviv to Istanbul. And from Istanbul, I got on a bus, and I would call it more like a Greyhound bus service they have in the States here. I got on a bus in Istanbul, and I don't have a price in my diary what I paid, but we went from Istanbul to Tehran, which is like 1,300 miles as the crow flies, so you can imagine how long it is on the road. Then from Tehran, which Tehran gave us a 10-day visa. I'll come back and talk about these individual cities later, but Istanbul to Tehran, and then from Tehran, I crossed the border at Mosh, and some of these towns I might mispronounce, and I apologize for that, but I crossed the border from Istanbul and went to Tehran, and I went from Tehran and I crossed the border into Afghanistan at Mosul, Iran. I did not go straight to Kabul. I stopped in Herat first, which is a fairly large city, very educated town. I want to get back and tell you more about Herat. But I went from Mashhad in Iran into Herat, and then Herat I went to Kandahar, and from Kandahar I went to Kabul. And from Kabul I took the Khyber Pass and Kabul Pass, which is mind-blowing. Y'all Google those two names. Kabul Pass, it's the same pass, but it's called the Kabul Pass in Afghanistan, and then it changes into the Khyber Pass as you get into Pakistan.
Almost everybody who takes the Hippie Trail talks about this.
It's incredible.
With legendary status. Can we come back and
Sure, I'm going to touch on it. Okay. I'll come back and tell you.
Come back and not.
Even though I didn't care for Pakistan at all, but I'll come back and touch on about the Khyber Pass in Pakistan, which it was mind-blowing. From Kabul, I took the Kabul Pass into the Khyber Pass to Peshawar, and from Peshawar I went to Lahore, and then from Lahore into India, to New Delhi, which was a big food city for me. Now, I'll come back to that, too.
It looks like in Delhi, that's where the trail divides into a choose-your-own-adventure direction of places to go.
You're correct. At that point, I had to make a decision whether I wanted to go down south to Goa from New Delhi. In Goa, at that time, I was hearing talks about drug addicts and hippies, dirty hippies. I consider myself a counterculture hippie, but I'm a clean guy. I look at different grades. It's kind of like religion. You have real religious people, like you have real big hippies, and then you have people, I'm very open-minded. I love to get high. That was what all this trip for me was, finding some of the most unusual, best-tasting marijuana, along with some of the best-tasting hash from the different countries. That I wanted to make sure that when I was smoking Afghanistan hash, I was in Afghanistan. I also was looking for the Nepalese hash with the white stuff in it, which was the opium. I wanted that. I enjoy getting high today as much as I did back there on the Hippie Trail. So I'll finish here. I kind of got sidelined there. When I crossed the border, I was in Delhi, and I decided instead of going to Goa, I had it in my mind that my final destination was Mount Everest. So I went north. And most of the travels I've just mentioned was all by bus. These were local bus companies, and I had a book that was called the Bit Book. And actually, I might be jumping around here, but that's who I want to dedicate this podcast to. His name is Jeff, and that's Geoff Crowther, Crowther. He passed away this year in April. He was 77 years old. As I said earlier, there were really no travel books, or all we had were maps. But Jeff put together what he called the Bit Book, and I had a copy of it. I don't know where I got it from, but it was more like a pamphlet. It was maybe 20 pages long, and it started, I think, in 1966 is when he started publishing it. And it grew to fairly large, a couple of hundred pages from what I understand. But I had one of the original editions, and it told you do's and don'ts and where to stay and what type of bus lines to ride on. But I'll touch on him later, but that's who I'd like to dedicate this to. I got it on a train in New Delhi. That's where I started riding the train. And I took a train from New Delhi through Lakshpur and Gorkashpur, and that took me to the border of Nepal. I can't remember the little town I crossed into Nepal from India, but it was by rickshaw. And I took a bus and I stayed at a hotel just over the border. And there was basically no customs. I did get a stamp. All these stamps are in my passport. I was very diligent on getting stamps from all the countries that I was in. And so I have a passport with all these stamps.
At that time, Nepal was wide open, but Tibet was closed.
Yeah, exactly. There were parts I couldn't go to Tibet. It was closed, definitely to Western travelers. There were parts of Eastern Europe I wanted to go to that I couldn't go to. Mm-hmm. But Pokhara, I went, once I crossed the border and I stayed in the little town, and I'll probably bring it up when I start talking about these individual towns. I think I wrote it down. But I went from this little town just across the border in Nepal, and I rode a bus. And these buses are like minivans because the Nepalese people are really short. And everybody, and when I mean everybody, I that includes animals, goats, pigs, chickens. They all get to ride on the bus too. And there's no bathroom control. But it wasn't that bad, really. The seats were really small. But the thing about Nepal is where I came across Buddha sticks and Thai sticks. In this little town I stayed in right across the border from India, I was in Nepal, and I had been looking for Buddha and Thai sticks. Again, I'm going to come back to some of these towns and get into a little more of the marijuana and the hashish I ran into.
Should we take a second and have a smoke break?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're now in Nepal, and I took a bus from the hotel I stayed at just over the border, and the hotel had Buddha and Thai sticks, and I got some of both. I then caught a bus and went from Pokhara, which is the second largest city in Nepal. It's 120 miles to Kathmandu, and the bus trip took 7 hours. And we had to stop 3 times so that I could sign in because I was a tourist. Obviously, if the bus was to go off the side of the cliff, then they knew that Seth was on it. You have to understand also that this is the foothills of the Himalayas, and so the countryside is just magnificent.
Those were checkpoints, basically, with like border patrol or military.
There were border checkpoints for basically tourists who's on the bus.
And in Nepal at that time, cannabis was legal.
I don't know if cannabis was legal. That's a good question. I just know it was everywhere, and hash was everywhere in Afghanistan.
So they weren't like searching for it.
No.
It was just like a check-in type deal going through there.
I had no paranoia at any of these checkpoints.
Good.
There were some countries going from Turkey into Iran. You want to be clean as a whistle, and you want to be pretty clean going into India. But again, there weren't too many days out of these 32 months where Seth was straight. Like I said, I love marijuana and hashish as much today as I did when I was 15 years old and smoking it. So on this road to Kathmandu, which was mind-blowing, Kathmandu was a really big food town. On this long journey, a lot of these towns, you were eating a lot of nuts and fruits. Kathmandu was what I call a foodie town. And from Kathmandu, I took a bus to New Delhi, and I flew to London to meet a friend I had met who later became my wife, which is a whole nother podcast. I flew from New Delhi to London, and then I came back to the States, and that was about 32 months. We're going to start in Istanbul, and in Istanbul there's a movie out called Midnight Express, and it's about an American who tried to smuggle hashish out of Istanbul, and he didn't make it, and they made a movie about it. And Turkey is not a place. I came from Tel Aviv In Israel, I had no problem. We're next door to Lebanon, and even though Israel's a very secure country, I smoked plenty of red Lebanese. I scored it from, I would go to Jerusalem, the old city. A volunteer who had been there when I got there introduced me to Misha. That's what we called him. He was a Palestinian Israeli. We would have a cup of tea in the tea shop. And remember, this is the old city, so it's got nooks and crannies like you've never seen before. After about 25 minutes or so drinking tea, I would tell him that I want 10 fingers. A finger's 3 grams of hash. Back in those days, it was about $8 to $10 to buy a finger. I would give him the money, and then we would walk out of the tea shop, and I would be walking behind him, and he would point over, and I would see this matchbox, and he would say, "There's 2 fingers in there," and we'd walk up another 3 or 4 steps, and underneath the doorway, there were 2 matchboxes, and he says, "Each of those have 3 fingers. So that's 6 and the 2, that's 8 fingers, and that's what you paid for." And then he'd disappear. And then like a dumbass, I would walk back down the steps and start picking up these 3 or 4 matchboxes and smiling big and make it back to the bus station in Jerusalem. And that's a whole trip. Israel was a trip. Ride the bus out about 15 miles from the kibbutz, and hitchhiking was very popular. I would stick my thumb out, and I'd get a ride all the way down this long country road to the kibbutz, and the volunteers, we would party. And that went on for 9 months. We made trips in every 3 to 4 weeks to stock up. And we actually grew a little marijuana on the kibbutz, which wasn't bad at all.
Cannabis is a big part of Israeli culture.
Cannabis is. There's a huge culture. Cannabis is very well accepted in Israel for study, for all different kinds of usage. What I'm going to touch on now is is the route I took and some of the bigger cities I went through. I'll give you an idea of kind of what I picked up in each of the towns and some of the places that I didn't care for. But we'll start in Istanbul at the pudding shop. I actually went to the pudding shop. That's a pretty cool place. That's where you got your visas, as I mentioned earlier, for some of the countries I was going through. It's where I had to get a new passport because I was in Israel for almost 10 months. The first 3 months, the Israelis don't stamp your passport, but after that, they do. So I had 3 Israeli stamps in my passport. And when I flew into Istanbul, we went to the American Embassy to inquire about visas for all these countries that we were going to go through and about our shots. And they're the ones that recommended that. They actually gave us the water purification pills, and they said that we needed new passports, that they could arrange to get them to us within a couple of days. These new passports, by the way, this was probably 1975. This was the first year that the small passports came out, which you get today.
This was due to the passports having the Israeli stamps. That they didn't want you traveling through the Middle East.
They didn't want me going.
Safety.
Right. They didn't want me going through countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iran. And even though they are in Iran, the Shah was in power then. The Shah was kicked out of power in 1977. I passed through Iran in 1975, maybe early 76. And it was pretty obvious to me that the people didn't care for this guy, nor his family. It didn't take a CIA investigation to figure it out. But I'll get to Tehran in a minute. I don't want to jump around here. Sure. But in Istanbul, we got our new passports, and we got visas for, Afghanistan, and we got visas for Iran. I don't think we needed one for India. I know in India we had to get our second phase of our yellow fever shot. We got our first phase in Istanbul, and we had to get our second phase at the American Embassy in New Delhi due to Nepal. They gave us malaria pills in case we came down with malaria because it was a malaria area that we were going to.
What was your favorite thing about Istanbul?
My favorite thing about Istanbul, I think, was the mixture of cultures with and there was a lot of political stuff going on at the time because there was a huge demonstration when we were at a travel agent trying to buy these bus tickets to get to Tehran. We were held up inside this travel agent for 5 or 6 hours, and I was scared shitless because I saw buses and buses loads of Turkish, military guys with helmets on as we made our way to this travel agent in Istanbul, and not knowing that there was this, and when I say there was a demonstration, I'm not talking hundreds of people. There were thousands of people. And I wasn't sure of the politics of Turkey at the time. But again, it was food. Because in Israel, the kibbutz I was on was middle class, and the food wasn't bad. But it wasn't like we had, chicken or steaks and french fries and potatoes. It wasn't like that. We did have some bagels and cream cheese, and there was no lox. But Istanbul was my first real seeing of the Hippie Trail, and I could see right away I was going to enjoy it. One of my buddies had actually scored some hash in Istanbul. I'm trying to think of the hotel's name we stayed at, but I can't remember it. But I remember smoking it in the room and getting pretty stoned. I don't reckon Turkey's not the place. I was 50-50 on smoking marijuana or hashish in Turkey back in 1974 or 75, but I did. But nothing like I'm going to come to in a minute here. Buckle your seatbelts, people.
So you're coming out of Istanbul, headed east towards Tehran. What's your vibe? What's your feeling? Are you excited going east? Are you excited to see the next stop?
No, I was not. I was not very excited knowing that we were heading towards Iran, because even back in those days, Iran just had this, I call him a dictator. America supported him. He was the Shah. And he basically, was taking bakshish, which are payments. He had, money stashed in all kinds of bank accounts, very wealthy. And he treated his people pretty bad. And Iran is very religious. Iran is also, it's very Shiite. And Iran is what I would call a 50-50. It's very Shiite. There are some Sunnis there, but they're also tribal. And tribal kind of trumps being a Shiite, because like I said, there can be two Shiite tribes that don't get along. So I was not looking real forward to going to Iran, because normally they only gave us a 10-day visa. Whereas in Afghanistan, it was 6 months. Pakistan, which I didn't care for, I'll talk about that in a minute. There was a 6-month visa. And Nepal was 6 months. And I'll talk about that quite a bit.
What triggered you to circumvent Beirut, Lebanon, and Amman, Jordan?
Because of living in Israel for 9 months and seeing that I wasn't about to take that route, that I wanted the northern route. And plus, it was putting me closer to Nepal. And these were long treks. But I just didn't want to, even though Beirut was known as the Paris of the Middle East, there was just a lot of unsettledness in some of those countries. Whereas I mentioned Afghanistan earlier and what it's like now, but back then it was pretty safe. And Pakistan is about like kind of what it is today. And Nepal was a lot safer. Nepal's had some overthrows of their monarchies over the last 20 years. And India has always been India. But I just didn't like the idea of some of the Arabic countries I'd have to be going through at that time. And I was Jewish. So after we left Istanbul and we came into Tehran, that was like a 20-hour bus ride. And I hated Tehran. I had this, as I mentioned earlier, I dedicated this podcast to Jeff. I had his bit book. And he said that there's only one hotel in the whole city of Tehran, which I think is several million people back then. It was called the Amir Kabir. And it was the only hotel that would rent a room to Westerners.
And that was like a hostel style.
It was like a hostel style, and it stunk. The guy that ran it was nice. And there's no drugs for us in Iran. That was another bummer. We tried to buy a bus ticket. We were going to take a bus to the train station in Tehran and take a train to Mashhad, where we were going to cross the border into Paradise, which was Afghanistan. I was looking forward to that, from what I heard from hippies coming from the other way.
How was the border crossing going into Iran?
It was not bad at all. The border crossing, they wanted to look in my backpack, and that was it. I actually mentioned that when I was in Iran at the customs coming through, that I said to in my diary, I actually read the day I crossed from Turkey into Iran, and I have a note that says I could have brought anything in I wanted. But you wouldn't have wanted to. It changed. It was like black and white going from Turkey into Iran. Iran, people were covered up. They started wearing the face masks, the
hijabs.
The hijabs on. and they wore the long skirts, and you didn't see a lot of women walking with the men. There were a lot of segregation there, a lot of segregation in Iran, whereas in Turkey it was a lot more Western. They're part of NATO. So Iran obviously is not part of NATO, but it's very Middle Eastern, very, I don't want to call it poor. It's just a whole different culture.
It's strange because it's come such a long way towards the Western culture now. It's now one of the most westernized nations.
It is, but you get out into the smaller towns and cities, and you would think you've gone back, 500 years in some of these cities, in 10 smaller towns. The bigger towns, there's no doubt that they become westernized, but in Tehran today, the women still have to wear their head coverings. So it's still, they've come a long way, but boy, they got a long way to go. And it's going to be tough because with their government, it has religion involved, whereas here in the United States, we have what you call separation.
Do we?
Well, we're supposed to, but I can tell you we're a lot better off than in parts of the Middle East.
Sure, yeah. I mean, Iran's gone back to the religious police patrolling, the morality police.
Yeah.
There's been massive protests over some
and
deaths
killings
that have occurred.
Of young women that just go uninvestigated. And I feel very fortunate with the hand I was dealt when I was born. This life is a journey, and I'm on this journey. And what I would tell everybody out there is you surround yourself with happy, positive, successful people. And success does not mean monetarily. And that's about the only thing I'll say personally. After Tehran, they would not sell us. When I say they, these are the places that sell tickets to get on a bus so you can ride it around town and get to the part of town where the train station is. They wouldn't sell us tickets at these bus stops, and we went to several of them. We finally got a taxi. Taxis wouldn't stop. There were 3 of us. Actually, there were 5 of us, but we split up so it'd be easier. And we finally got a taxi to pick us up, and he took us to the train station. And we rode a train from Tehran to Mashhad, which is the border crossing from Iran into Afghanistan. And leaving Iran, there was really no search, but you walk for, I would say, maybe 100, at least 100 yards. It could be 150 yards down maybe a 20-yard wide hallway that has glass windows with backpacks or sandals or belts, you name an item, a canteen, a water cup. These are Westerners, tourists who were busted trying to smuggle drugs in to Iran from Afghanistan or smuggle drugs out of Iran or vice versa. And they gave their name and their age and how long they'd been in jail. And knowing I was clean, it still gave you goosebumps. We were escorted from the border at Mashhad to a waiting van in Afghanistan. I'd say 4 or 5 Iranian soldiers escorted maybe 10 of us. This van took us to the beautiful, lovely town of Herat, Afghanistan, which was one of the last towns to fall with the recent Taliban takeover. In Herat, I loved it. I stayed there maybe a week and a half. 5 brothers owned this hotel. I was paying less than $1 a night, and I never had to buy hash because they shared it. They broke off a chunk the size of a hockey puck like it was nothing. And it was party down in Herat. I actually think Jay asked me if I would take out a page of my diary. I kept a diary for about 16 months. And one of it is my day in Herat, where the food was okay, but the people are very nice. And what I would say to you people listening to this podcast is what's happening in Afghanistan is really sad. I loved Afghanistan. If you look at video on the news when you're watching stories about Afghanistan, take notice of the people and notice how straight and tall that they walk and stand. And that's because they're a very proud people. They've been fighting wars since Genghis Khan, thousands of years.
And always the underdog. I mean,
they're always the underdog.
Fighting superpowers of the world, whether it's the Russians or the Americans.
Absolutely. I was there just after the Russians had just left.
It's probably littered with tanks.
It was. They left them on the highway. It was really a shame because not that I necessarily agree with the Islam religion. When I say agree, that I would practice it. It's not for me. And obviously somebody who practices Islam and is someone who's a moderate will tell you that Islam doesn't believe in these radical terrorist organizations. And it's just a shame we have to deal with that in today's world. Back then, when I was traveling the Hippie Trail and in Israel, there weren't probably as many offshoots of these radical organizations, but the big one was the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. From Herat, I took a bus. It was 100, and let me check my notes here. Herat.
It's funny your perspective of like, we pulled into Afghanistan and that's when the party started, because I don't think most people listening
would agree with that,
or just would have
understand
that
it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's such an opposite perspective to hear.
The Afghanis loved the counterculture hippies passing through. They learned so much, and the counterculture, the hippies, people just know that they just are friendly and loving, and so they give things away. And it wouldn't be unusual for a hippie to give a shirt to an Afghani boy. When I was in Pokhara, Nepal, I took 3 or 4 little kids to the movies. It was like 4 cents to get into the movies, and these kids, it was poor. And one day I took 4 or 5 of these young kids into the movies, and it's a good feeling, So, yeah, you wouldn't understand. It's hard to understand how the party begins in Afghanistan, but it did, man. I mean, he broke out the hookahs at where you check in, and in Afghanistan, they squat down like you would think an Indian squats down with their butt just above with your knees up by your chin, and they bring out these big hookahs. And let the party begin. Of course, being Western, we would break off a big chunk and stick it on the end of a safety pin and light it and let it burn and catch on fire, and then put a jar over it and let it go out, and then we would suck the smoke out. And after the second or third time, it was great, because we had been straight for like 3 days, and that's a long time for me.
That's a long time,
especially in Israel. I was getting high every day.
Yeah, that'd be a tough 3 days for me.
It was a tough 3 days.
And in a place like Iran,
In a place like Iran, Iran was, it was bad there, and it's worse now. But Herat was a blast.
How far is it from Herat to Kabul?
Let me see if I put that on my notes.
I was going to kind of ask about the terrain in between those 2 cities. Is it just
it's
mountainous?
It's very mountainous, but it's barren. There's not much trees. It wasn't pretty like Nepal.
Is that the Hindu Kush Mountains there?
Hindu Kush Mountains. You got it. Yeah. It's very pretty.
That current day is about 15 hours.
That sounds about right.
And
I was going to say 10.
What's the mode of transport out of
It was
Herat?
a bus, but again, the bus was packed in Afghanistan, and you see them today, even though a lot of them were destroyed, but back in the 75, it would be like a dump truck that you would see here in the States, but maybe not as built as well with all that steel like you see on a dump truck that hauls gravel or loam. They had these trucks that hauled people, and they were lit up psychedelic. All of them. Wheels, windshields, the sideboards. And, I mean, it was incredible. You obviously could see them coming down the highway. And they would go from the size of a minivan, but the majority of these were like the size of dump trucks. And they were all different. They all had their own style that they would put on their trucks, and they also painted them. And it's not something that I would ride on, but it carried goods, and it carried the local people. I'm sure they paid a fee to the driver to help pay for petrol. But that was something that was very interesting in Afghanistan. While I was in Afghanistan, I saw many, many poppy fields. I never got into the opium. I've only done it one time, and I ate it in a rolled up piece of toilet paper when I was in Herat. When I scored the Buddha sticks and Thai sticks, the guy also had raw opium, and he says you can just eat it. And so that night, my wife didn't think I should talk about that night on how much fun it was because we all ate it.
I'll admit myself, I've personally smoked opium in college.
Yeah.
It was almost too delightful.
It was almost too, we didn't smoke this, we ate it. But I mean, for the next 6 or 7 hours, Muhammad Ali came up, fly like a butterfly and sting like a bee. And that's exactly what it was like. It was such a blast. And believe it or not, this is at night, and there's no fear. It was very safe to be out at night. Obviously, there's no alcohol, and you abide by their rules and regulations, which hashish was A-okay. And that's, I'm not a big alcoholic drinker, so booze didn't bother me. But it was a long trip from Herat to Kabul. But once you got to Kabul, I had mail, which was very unusual. I hadn't had mail, and I'd been on the road now on the Hippie Trail for going on 3 weeks, and I had no mail in these other towns in Tehran. I didn't have anything in Istanbul because I had just left from the Hippie Trail. But in Kabul, I had a couple of letters, one from my mom and dad and one from one of my brothers. So it was pretty exciting.
I don't know anybody that's gotten mail in Kabul.
I got mail at the American Express office in Kabul, Afghanistan on Freak Street. People who are listening to this who did the Hippie Trail know, Eric, you know what I'm talking about, when my hotel was just off Freak Street. Yeah, in my notes here it says, I talked about those colorful trucks all over Afghanistan and all the different types of the hippie buses that I would see pull through these towns that I was not on. But in Kabul, I took a bus trip and this kind of gets a little bit sad, but I don't look at it as being sad anymore. I look at it as I'm happy it happened. So the sadness is completely gone, but I'm happy that it happened. I'm looking for here it is. When I was in Kabul, I spent maybe a month there because I just liked it so much. I took a bus from Kabul up to Mazar-e Sharif, which is up in the northern part of Afghanistan. The people that live up there, the tribes that live up there, are very fierce, independent people. And it's where they mine this stone called the lapis stone. It's a blue stone. It's the only place in the world where you can mine it. It's pretty far up there. It was a long day. I spent maybe 3 days on this trip. And on the way up there, you go through a town called Bamran. And in Bamran, the bus stopped. And in the side of the mountain were these 2 Buddha statues carved into the side. One was, I would say, 10 stories high. And it was amazing. And there's the one next to it that was maybe 3 to 4 stories high.
I believe those were destroyed by the Taliban.
They were destroyed by the Taliban, and I think I even wrote the date down that they destroyed them. I think it was 2006.
Bastards.
Yeah, no, bastards is a polite word. Obviously, the Taliban doesn't believe in Buddhism or Confucianism or Judaism, and that's fine. But to blow up these statues, and I've seen them, so now they're rubble. I think there's parts of them left in the side of this mountain, but the mountain, it's really weird. You could walk up to them. It's not like you looked at them and they were like, 500 feet up in the air and you couldn't see them. You could walk up to them, and where the hills came into the ground, that was all barren, and they carved it, and it was all rock, and they carved these 2 statues, and that was in Byron. And I remember that, and only in the last 10 years have I started to, some things that I looked at as being sad that's happened. It's not being sad anymore, but being happy that it happened, and not being sad that it's gone. But it's happy that it happened. I saw it, and other people saw it. I would have to say that Mazar-e-Sharif was a big highlight of the trip. But then again, man, once I left Kabul, and it's the Kabul pass into Peshawar is 132 miles. Mm-hmm. And once I left Afghanistan, I felt a loss of fun. We had such a blast there. And we came into Pakistan, and it was like, oh no. It wasn't as bad as Iran, but you're not going to smoke any hash there. You're not going to smoke any marijuana there. I was on my way to Nepal, which I knew was going to hopefully be like Afghanistan. As I left Kabul, I went through the Kabul Pass, which was mind-blowing, just mind-blowing, which turns into the Khyber Pass, which is on the Pakistani border, which there was no customs. In fact, it took a while to find someone to get a stamp in my passport. That's how unsecure the border was. It was in tribal land. The government does not control the Khyber Pass when I was there, nor do they control it today. There were people coming up to the bus, and we're on a regular bus. I skipped something in the bit book. Jeff talks about never ride buses in Afghanistan without windows. And so I made it a point never to. And he explains why, that they have banditos in Afghanistan, and it's easier for them to get a hold of the bus driver and pull over the bus by speeding up on their motorcycles and coming in through the window at a high rate of speed, believe it or not. So he always said to ride buses with windows, and I did. So now I'm going through the Khyber Pass, and people are coming up trying to sell me. It wasn't even hash yet. It was you had to rub it in the palm of your hand for a couple of hours, and it would turn into hash. And I was just too scared, knowing what I had read in the bit book. Jeff is a big stoner, and that's why I learned so much from him on what to do and what countries to be careful of if you're going to smoke. And Pakistan was one of them. So we didn't buy any of the hashish or even some of the marijuana we saw that they were hanging up at the window to buy. And we kind of, crossing after we came through the Khyber Pass, came into New Delhi. And we hung out in New Delhi for a week and a half or two. I went to the Golden Temple and stayed there for free for 3 or 4 days, and they feed you. I was starting to get low on funds too. And so I'd heard about the Golden Temple, and it was incredible. You walk into this Golden Temple after you get past the guard that you would think you're watching a Walt Disney movie, because the way this guy's dressed, he's got a dagger stuck in this huge belt. The dagger's got to be 2 foot long, and it's shaped like a boomerang, and he's got it's some of you would see at a string cheese show who really want to wear a great costume, man. He would fit right in. So after hanging out in Delhi, which was a blast. It was lots of food. It was all these places I'm mentioning, from Afghanistan and even Iran and Pakistan and India and Nepal. The accommodations, I'm not paying any more than a buck a night for a room. And if I have a hot shower, it might be $1.25 if I'm able to get a hot shower. The hot showers in Afghanistan, you had to produce yourself. You would buy wood, and they would weigh it with motor parts. And that's how they determined how much to charge you. I kid you not, he would put a steering wheel on the other end of this scale, and then he'd put wood on the other side. And when they got it even, it wasn't expensive, but it was the fact on the stuff he used to weigh the wood, which I never understood, and I don't understand it today. So in New Delhi, it was a blast. And I happened to be in New Delhi when they had the Festival of Color, which I've looked it up, which was in March. And the Festival of Color is where, and everybody gets involved. I don't think it matters what religion, the Sheikhs or Buddhists or Hare Krishnas. They all get along, and what you do is you get balloons and you fill them up. You put in some dye in the water and you fill them up so that they're all different colors, and you just start throwing them everywhere when you're walking down the street, if you're on your hotel balcony. And this went on for a half a day, and we got involved. We bought balloons, and we had a blast, and we ate good food. And the food in all these countries I'm talking about, I could eat definitely. I wouldn't call it lunch or dinner. I always call it snacking. There's always lots of nuts and lots of fruit. But in some of these big foodie towns, like in New Delhi, I ran into pancakes. There were eggs made the way you like them. They had bacon. It was pretty interesting being in Delhi, coming out of Pakistan, which I didn't spend very, very long in Pakistan because I didn't care for it.
It's kind of a place where you just keep it moving, huh?
You keep it moving.
Yeah. In India at that time, I know there's a lot of culture surrounding ashrams was very big.
Very
were
big.
you visiting
Yeah,
ashrams?
I went to the Hare Krishna ashram. Funny you mentioned that. It was interesting to watch and see how these people get into these mental states from meditation or praying. And basically, it's religion. And I've met an Indian guy in Evergreen, where I live now, who actually, that's who he follows. Whatever sect that is, it's the Golden Temple for him. With the Hare Krishnas, they were very happy, plenty of food. There was always offering food. What I really got into were the meditators, these guys that could do feats that were not really thinking humans were able to accomplish. I saw some guys, they were in a small square clear box that a 3-year-old would have trouble getting into and curling up, and this guy was in there, curled up in there, and that impressed me. I don't know why. Obviously, I'm stoned. India, we did come across some smoke. It wasn't very hard to find.
How was the cannabis in India?
It was okay. It worked. It was better than what I was brought up in Houston, Texas on Mexican swag for the first 3 or 4 years. It wasn't bad, but I knew that Nepal was coming up. So what I did, in India, you travel by train, and they pack the trains, and they run on time. And so, you got to go down to the train station and get in. Most of this traveling in the city was by rickshaw. And we got to the train station, and English is it might not be the number one language in India, but it's number 2. Most of the Indians speak English. So, and even though sometimes they're hard to understand, we were able to get tickets, and we got tickets from New Delhi, and I started heading north. When I got into, I want to say I crossed the border. I went to Lakshpur and into Gorkashpur. I passed through, and I crossed into Nepal, into a little town called Siddharth Hangar. And that's where I spent the night, and that's where I saw the Buddha sticks, and I was in hog heaven. It was just incredible. I remember the gentleman. He was very nice. Obviously a stoner, a Nepalese stoner, and he loaded me up with the Buddha sticks, and I caught the bus inside her hangar to go to Pokhara. And I don't know how long that bus trip, it was by bus, but I don't have written down how long it was. I think it was within 4 or 5 hours we were in Pokhara. It could have been only 40 miles, but it's the roads, and these are the foothills of the Himalayas now. So all the sceneries, I had out of Delhi and go north, the scenery starts to change drastically, because I'm getting into, I've already come out of the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, which were bare, and now I'm coming into the Himalayas, which aren't bare. There's rivers, and it's beautiful, valleys and trees, and great smoke, good hash, good marijuana.
How was the border crossing going into Nepal?
Not a problem at all. Stamped my passport and let me in. Very friendly.
Great.
I don't know what it's like today, but to go from Pokhara, where I was there maybe a week, and I took those kids to the movies, and I was smashed every day. I took a bus, I guess it's just a regular old bus, with locals on it, and pigs on it, and chickens on it, to go to Kathmandu. And that was 120 miles, and that took 7 to 8 hours.
What's something like that cost?
About 50 cents. It's very cheap. I was living on the Hippie Trail including buying my marijuana and my hashish for $3 a day. That's room, food, and my drugs, And it's not that I'm not a druggy people. I just enjoy getting stoned, and I enjoy smoking hash or marijuana. It's my body and my choice, and I think I'll do it to the day I die, because it's just it's something I enjoy.
I'm going to go out on a limb, too, and just say that the folks that are listening to a podcast about the Hippie Trail might also appreciate cannabis.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. From Kathmandu, which was a incredible town, another big foodie town, that's where I found the Thai sticks. I came across the Nepalese black hash with the opium in it. We stayed there probably maybe 3 weeks, and then I took a bus from Kathmandu back to New Delhi. I don't know how long that was. It was definitely a full day, and that was around $2.50.
So you didn't go to Everest?
No, I did. I did. I saw Everest out of the 3 weeks I was there. because there's cloud cover on it. But there were 3 or 4 days where it was plain to see. And I should mention that when I was in Kathmandu, you can take these 2 or 3 day hikes, and I did maybe 3 or 4 of them. This is really important because this is, and I shouldn't have, I'm seeing it on my notes here. You could take one of the little towns or village. These are villages, and you could stay in the village for free as long as you drank their Thai, which is their tea, and you ate their food. And so you're talking 50 or 60 cents to have a place to lay your head at night and to eat. And these villages, they kind of survive on the hippies that would do these treks. And these treks would take 2 or 3 days each.
I think of Namche Bazaar as being one of those towns that was really reliant on the Everest traffic
coming through there, and they appreciate it. And for some reason, us kind of culture people always feel like leaving something just for them, maybe something Western that they could take hold of and just remember me by. Because these people were some of the nicest people that I ran into on the Hippie Trail with these treks, and I did 3 or 4 of them. And what these treks do, and you walk them, usually I say you sign up, but there was a place to meet on Freak Street, and you could take off with, when you meet people, you can obviously know if you're going to get along with some people or that you click better with others. And on these treks, it was me and one other person, at least one other person, but sometimes there were 3, 4, or 5 of us. And we would walk over 3 or 4 days, and we would stay in 2 or 3 different villages along the way. And we were getting closer and closer to Mount Everest and these huge peaks and these valleys and some of these rivers. They were incredible. We actually ate some fish. I don't even know what type of fish it was. And I'm not a big fish person, but the way they cooked it, and obviously there's no forks or spoons, so you eat with your right hand and you usually use the bread. Bread's a very, very big staple.
Like naan?
Yeah, it's like naan bread, but it's not all naan bread. They all have their own mixtures. I spent a week camping down when I was in Israel in the Sinai Desert in Nuweiba and Dahab. And this guy would come by. You would stay in these little lean-tos. And he would come by, and with sand, a little sand and water and a touch of flour, and he would make these huge type of what you're calling naan bread. And they were 10 cents.
Wow.
And I would get 2 of them. And, I would either have peanut butter with me or something and roll it up with jam. I usually traveled with food. But when I took a bus from Kathmandu to New Delhi, and then I was in New Delhi for a few days, and I was flying back to London to meet the woman I had lived on the kibbutz with for about 6 months. And then from there, I flew back to the States. And kind of until I met you, Jay, I hadn't pulled any of these papers out in over 40 years. And going back and looking at this, and then looking at what's going on over there now in some of these areas. Because today, even if the trail was open, it's now tourist. Before forget about Afghanistan, but even India, it's a big tourist spot. When you get into Nepal, Kathmandu was not polluted. I'm told today Kathmandu is a very polluted city. And Pokhara, they built it up. There's a lake in Pokhara where the hotel I stayed at, the way the guy, when the bus pulled up, there was one car in Pokhara, and it was a taxi. And he said, if you stay at my hotel, I'll make sure that you have some good marijuana flower and you can fish in the lake. And that's where I stayed. And it was his house. It was mom and dad, and they wanted, they were living off us. And I went fishing, and I didn't catch anything, but I sure got stoned. He brought in and these are some big nugs. Those are some of the biggest nugs I saw. Not that I saw a bunch of shrimp buds, but no.
I didn't hear you talk much about flour. It was obviously a lot about hash. Were there places that did have more flour than others?
Yes,
and
there were.
And how was the product?
In Afghanistan, the flour was very good as long as you smoked the flour where they didn't use it to make hash. It was very potent flour, but there was some flour that they used, and I don't know why they would use this particular field to make hash in this particular field to have flour. They weren't really big on flour like we are. They were more into hash. But I saw a lot of poppies and a lot of marijuana in all parts of Afghanistan, especially up in the Hindu Kush. and I saw a lot of marijuana plants in Nepal on my drive from Pokhara to Kathmandu. I was surprised at the amount of marijuana fields that were right up to the road. Nice looking stuff, because they get their rains.
A lot of the indica comes out of the base strains.
I wouldn't know if it's indica or sativa. I just know that it could fuck you up. It was good stuff. I love smoking a new strain, and the taste was always good. Actually, when we scored the opium in Herat, along with the Buddha stick, the guy had Quaaludes. Back in the day, they had these and I wasn't much of a pill guy, but Quaaludes was a drug. I guess you call it a downer. They don't make them anymore. The only reason they don't make them anymore is because the DEA went to Aurora, which is the pharmaceutical company based in either, I think it's Sweden or Switzerland, and they told them to quit making them.
Which is unfortunate. I've heard such good things, and I was born after that period.
Yeah, growing up, that was, like I said, I wasn't a pill guy. I definitely took my share of LSD, but not many pills. I did do Quaaludes a couple times, but the Quaaludes were in their own field, and then they kind of disappeared, and, life goes on, so.
Another thing you didn't really talk about on the Hippie Trail is use of psychedelics. It was a lot about cannabis. I wonder if you could kind of talk about it a little bit.
I didn't see much psychedelics. I will say this, in Israel, there was a backpacker from Chicago that showed up to be a volunteer on the kibbutz and had some LSD. And me and her and another person, we went to, in Israel, water is very scarce. Fresh water. They have the Lake of Tiberias up north and the Jordanian River that runs through Israel, which goes into Jordan. Israel allocates so much water to homes or kibbutzim, and up on Lake Tiberias they have these caves where back in the day when a lot of people were nomadic like the Bedouins, if it was a bad storm they would take their sheep or goats into these caves. And these caves were pretty cool. And that's where I ate some of this LSD when we were up at Lake Tiberias, which is beautiful country. We didn't sleep in the cave. We slept outside underneath the stars. But that's the one time that comes to mind with LSD. If I wanted that, I could have gone to Goa, and it would have been everywhere. I wasn't really looking for LSD. I had done my LSD way too young, but back in high school. But I'm learning today that these millennials are coming out with this incredible liquid LSD, what they call it, squirts. And I've tried it, not a full dose, but you know what? I liked it. It's a very clean feeling, and way to go, guys. I think, carry your freak flag high and proud.
Yeah, there's some great liquid LSD around, as I understand.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the same people who were manufacturing it in previous years, I think some of that stuff's still being released and output.
It is.
And so whether it's old or new or...
It's new. Actually, I saw a documentary, and I can't remember the lady's name, but I think she's originally born in Portugal, but she does these incredible documentaries, scary stuff where she meets gun runners that to run guns into Mexico.
Mariana Van Zelman.
That's her. She actually recently in the last year, and she said it was the hardest contact she's ever had to track down. There's only a handful of people that know how to make true LSD.
It's always been a very secretive,
it's very
veiled
secretive,
process.
And these people know each other, and she found one who was willing to talk to her. And he says that he and they surface maybe once a year, maybe twice, and they usually have 50, 60 pounds, liquid pounds. And there's a distribution system that distributes it, I guess you would say, around the world. And I have done some squirts, and let me tell you, man, it's the real McCoy, and it's clean, and yeah, I still like my marijuana and hashish.
I love to hear that, though, because a lot of folks who've lived through the 60s and 70s will say, oh, the stuff back then, And it's nice to hear a perspective of, the stuff current day is
current
good,
day. Yeah, back then, they talk about Ozzy, who from the Grateful Dead made Ozzy Acid, Orange Barrel Sunshine. I've been there. And to my knowledge, what I had was Orange Barrel, and I've done Purple Dot and the whole bit, all the different varieties. And there was a feeling that you would get when you would take it that with today's you do not get. And that's a huge change. When I say a feeling you get, sometimes it's kind of a dirty feeling or just an unkempt feeling. And
it's not as clean.
And so that's a good way to put it. This L is very clean. Actually, she talked about it's not that easy to produce this. These guys, so they're not discovered, make their own precursors. So they're not out buying this stuff that they have to make the L with. They make that stuff themselves. So these guys are very, very smart.
A lot of that's happening with the cocaine in South America and Peru and Colombia. They were shipping stuff, and even in Mexico and into America, they were shipping stuff from China to use as precursors, and a lot of that stuff now is being manufactured by the cartels and the organizations themselves.
Exactly, yeah.
I wonder if you can talk about coming out of Delhi into England and back stateside.
It was a shock.
What is the feeling when you reflected and the immediate? I
flew from Delhi into London for $200, and by that time I had less than $200. And like I said earlier, I had a student ID that claimed I went to the University of Colorado. I had a friend who was going to school there, and she filled out the papers, and I got the student ID. So, which I don't know how much it helped, but at the customs, the English customs flying into London at Heathrow, it might have been Gatwick. No, I think it was Heathrow. Anyway, he was concerned about letting me in the country, knowing I'd been traveling for 30-something months, and wanted to know when I was going to go back to school and how much money I had on me. And I informed him that I was here to visit my girlfriend and then fly back to the States. And it went through several channels. I sat there waiting for over 2 hours, and they finally, I think they went out to find my girlfriend, and she was with her mother. They finally allowed me out because they claimed that they were going to make sure financially I was taken care of. And then we hung out in London for maybe a month. That's a story where she was supposed to have had her visa ready, and she went to the American embassy to get it. And when she was being interviewed, she said she was going to America to live with her American boyfriend. That's a romper room no-no. You don't say that if you're trying to get a visa to go tour the United States. That's what she should have just applied for, was a visa. So I thought I could fix it, and I went down to the American embassy with her, and the only type of visa they were going to issue her would be a fiancé visa. And I've had people say they had those back then. Apparently there's some TV shows now where these reality shows where these women or men need to get fiancé visas. Well, they had fiancé visas in 1977, and she got one. We got married on the 89th day, and we were married for 19 years. And we had 2 children, and I'm retired. I've been happily married to my wife now for 20 years, and I'm living the dream. I have no complaints. I feel very, very fortunate that I did this trip now talking to Jay. Out a page of my diary that I thought I would read, and I just opened the book, and I couldn't read word for word because the way I wrote the diary was kind of, I don't want to call it pig Latin, you can call it Seth Latin, that with misspelled words. It's definitely not written correctly. But what I say in here is all true. I'll read you January 24th. This is actually 1977. I got up at 7 a.m. By 8:30, the bus hit the road. We arrived at the Turkish-Iranian border. So this day, I'm driving from Istanbul to the Iranian border to cross into Iran. 8:30, the bus arrived. We're to head to the Turkish-Iranian border. We get there at 9:30 at night. I had my Turkish entry visa in my canceled passport. Remember I told you I had to get a new passport? Well, I had a Turkish visa. Apparently I got that in Israel, but it was in my canceled passport. So I had to show them that along with my new American visa that I had obtained at the passport in Istanbul. The next was the Iranian border. By luck, they gave all 5 of us a 10-day transit visa. I thought that was pretty far out. Then we came to Iranian customs. What a joke. They made me open up my backpack and said, okay. I could have brought anything in, but it's Iran, so you don't do that, according to the bit. By 6 a.m., we will be in Tehran. and I will get my Afghan visa there. Ciao for now, later, Gator. This is February 26, 1977. We got up at 6 o'clock a.m. for a $2.40 bus trip from Pokhara, Nepal to Kathmandu, Nepal. It was 132 miles and it took 6 to 8 hours through some of the most beautiful, breathtaking valleys and foothills I have ever seen of the Himalayas. We had a lunch stop at 11:30 where I scored. I scored some Thai sticks to enhance the scenic beauty. Pot was growing everywhere. This is too much. This country is far out. In Kathmandu, we found a nice hotel near Freak Street for $1 a night for two, with a hot shower, which I shall test in the morning. We spent the rest of the day exploring Kathmandu. What a food town. We had hash tea and grass cakes and scored Nepalese hash mixed with opium. The weather is beautiful here. Back at the hotel, it's early evening, we get stoned. I shall lay my stony body to rest until we meet again. I get sensitive now that I think about it. But no, Jay, this was very interesting for me, as I hope it was for you, to sit down and discuss my journey back then.
It's a beautiful picture you paint. I wonder, in looking at it all these years later, what's your takeaway from the entirety of that experience?
I take away where it brought in spirituality into my life, which obviously this journey, I was on a search. I was searching. I was 19, 20, 21. And I think I was searching for something on this journey through life to take me through it in a positive way and in a good way. And I figured it out. It was spiritually. And that's where I've been ever since. I surround myself with happy people, successful people, positive people. And I owe a lot to my mom and dad and my 3 other brothers. There's 4 boys in our family, and we're all within 5 years, and we're all very close. And I owe a lot of that to family.
I can see the gratitude pouring out of you for that upbringing, and thank you for telling all of these stories, and I'm grateful to be your neighbor.
High five.
I got great vibes from you right when we met you guys.
Yeah.
Just, to have...
That's good.
To have your wife wander over and invite us to sit down. And then...
She did that. I said, what are you doing? She's looking around. She goes, we got 2 chairs here. It's something I think I would, I'm not thinking about it. I'm thinking I'm listening to the band. She goes, we got 2 chairs here, and there's, people are eating. We can find someone that'll use these chairs. And she goes, I found them. I'm going to go get them.
And here we are now, sitting here.
Here we are now, having this conversation. And
it's interesting how that works.
It's very interesting how it works, but that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
I say that's what the hokey pokey's all about. You put your right foot in. That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Talking to my wife, I was telling her that, I don't think Jay's been on the Hippie Trail, but he knows so much about it. And you hadn't told me whether you had done it or not, but I figured you would have popped when we were talking at the cheese shows, you would have told me. But he knows so much about it that for me to be able to sit down and talk to him about it, and he's so interested in it. And to be honest with you, a lot of my notes and stuff, I'd lost track. Most of what came out on this was coming from remembering what I wrote down. I dress kind of, I don't want to say I dress hippie-ish, but, I dress like the way I feel. I like to wear lots of color. I I like to advertise cheese.
I was going to say, you say you don't like to dress like a hippie, but you got a Grateful Dead watch, a string cheese shirt, long hair.
But it's all clean. Yeah, I do have a Grateful Dead, yeah. And I got long hair, and I got a nice beard that I've had this beard. I grew the beard on the trip. I sold my razor. I've had this beard 55 years. I trim it, but I've never shaved it off. I believe when you do good things, and there's a Hebrew word called a mitzvah, which you don't look for recognition, you just do it. And yet, I find that it always comes back around somewhere positive. For the last year, it's been like riding the wave, especially the last 2.5, 3 weeks of going to see my band like 7 or 8 times in 14 days. I'm hanging 10. It's been balls to the walls, hold my calls. I'm changing some of my thoughts. Keep it cheesy.